A Hell's Angel leader was born blind, until a black teen did the impossible. For 60 years, this biker ruled the road with fists, fury, and darkness. He couldn't see the world, but everyone feared his name. Then one rainy night, his life crashed, and the person who saved him wasn't a doctor or a priest, just a quiet teenager with faith strong enough to move mountains. At first, the biker mocked him, cursed him, hated his kindness. But then, something miraculous happened. For the first time in his life, he saw light. Real light. Now, a man who's only ever lived by violence faces the hardest fight of all, choosing between the gang that made him and the miracle that changed him. But miracles come with a price, and darkness never lets go without a fight. Can one boy's faith really heal the man the world already gave up on? Or will the past drag them both back into the dark forever? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Rain came down like nails against the old highway. The night was black, and the world smelled like oil and smoke. Mick Bones Delaney gripped the handlebars of his Harley, feeling the rumble deep in his chest. He couldn't see the road, but he could feel it. He'd been blind since the day he was born, yet every vibration, every shift in the air told him where to turn, when to brake, and how to ride. For 60 years, Mick had lived in darkness. Not just the kind behind his eyes, the kind that got into a man's soul. He'd built his name leading the Iron Saints, a motorcycle club feared up and down Arizona. He never saw the faces of the men he led, but he heard their laughter when they fought, smelled their sweat and whiskey, and called it family. But tonight wasn't a ride for glory. Tonight was a ride to forget. A week earlier, a young boy had been killed, hit by a biker during one of their races through a small desert town. The club said it wasn't their fault. Mick knew better. He could still hear the mother's scream, piercing through the engine noise. Now the road twisted beneath him, slick with rain. His chest tightened. The weight of what he'd done, what he'd allowed, pressed down like a hand around his throat. He sped faster, the wind whipping through his long gray hair. Maybe he wanted the storm to take him. Maybe that was the plan. Lightning flashed. Thunder rolled like the growl of his old Harley. For one wild second, he imagined what light might look like. He had never seen a sky before, or a storm, or the color blue, but he could picture it now. Fierce, alive, merciful. Then the tires slid. The crash came fast and cruel. Metal screamed. His body flew through rain and pain, the world spinning. The sound of the engine faded into a low hum in his mind. Then nothing at all. He woke to the smell of bleach and soap. The room was quiet, except for a soft hum of fluorescent lights. Mick tried to move, but pain answered from every bone. His head throbbed. His throat was dry. "Easy there," a woman said gently. "You're in a hospital." He turned his head toward her voice. "Am I dead?" "Not yet," she said with a small chuckle. "Though it's a miracle you're not. You went through the guardrail." Mick groaned. "Then why didn't you let me finish the job?" The woman sighed. "Because somebody was praying too hard for that." He frowned. "Praying? For me?" She leaned closer. "A young man found you on the road. Stayed with you till the ambulance came. Prayed over you the whole time. Been checking in every day since." He didn't know what to say. Nobody prayed for him. Not since his mother left him at the orphanage. Not since he'd started drinking, fighting, and running the Saints. The woman's tone softened. "You're lucky, Mr. Delaney. The doctors say you'll walk again, but you need rest and rehab. The police will want to talk when you're stronger." Mick gave a weak laugh. That'll be a fun chat. A few days later, he heard new footsteps by his bed. Light, cautious ones. "Hey," said a young voice. "You awake?" Mick turned toward the sound. "Guess so. You the preacher?" A chuckle. "Not even close. Just the guy who dragged you out of the rain." He sounded young, barely grown, but steady, like someone twice his age. "Name's Carlos," the boy said. "They said you don't see much, so I'll keep it simple. You got busted ribs, a banged-up shoulder, and a mean attitude." Mick smirked. "You got a mouth on you." "Yeah," Carlos said easily. "But I got patience, too. You need both to help people like you." "Help me?" Mick scoffed. "Kid, I've done things that'd turn your stomach. I don't need help." Carlos didn't flinch. Everybody needs help, even the ones who say they don't. There was something about the way he said it, steady, not judging. Mick almost hated that calm. He grumbled, "So what are you, some kind of church boy?" "Something like that," Carlos said. "Doing my service hours here. But you don't got to talk about church. I can just sit here." And he did. For a long time, neither spoke. Rain pattered against the window. Somewhere down the hall, a radio played an old gospel song. Soft, distant. Days passed. The nurses moved Mick to a rehab center on the edge of town, a small place run by a church. He cursed the decision at first. He didn't want sermons. He wanted whiskey. But Carlos worked there too. And somehow, the kid's quiet voice and easy smile started to chip away at the walls Mick had built. One morning, Carlos guided him to a bench outside. The air smelled of wet soil and pine. "You ever listen to the world when it's quiet?" he asked. Mick huffed. "Quiet means nothing's worth hearing." Carlos smiled. "I think quiet's where God talks the loudest." Mick turned his face toward the sound of birds. "If he's talking, he ain't talking to me. Maybe you just ain't listening yet." The words hung in the air, simple but heavy. Mick didn't answer. For the first time in a long while, he didn't have one. When Carlos walked away, Mick tilted his head to the sky. He couldn't see the sun, but he felt its warmth on his scarred face. It had been years since he noticed something that gentle. That night, he lay in the dark, listening to the rain again. He heard Carlos in the next room praying quietly. "Lord, show him light, even if it's just a flicker." Mick swallowed hard. The words stirred something deep inside, a spark of memory, a heartbeat he thought long dead. He didn't believe in miracles, but somehow, for the first time in 60 years, he wanted to. Morning came slow, gray, and damp. The rain had softened to a mist that drifted across the rehab center's courtyard like breath on a cold window. Mick woke to the smell of oatmeal and the squeak of rubber soles in the hall. His ribs burned when he moved. His shoulder felt like hot iron. He lay still and listened, counting steps and voices the way a blind man learned to do. A light knock sounded on the door. "You up?" the young voice asked. "Been up since pain woke me," Mick said. The door clicked, shoes scraped, a chair slid closer. "I brought you oatmeal and coffee. Doctor says you can have both if you go slow." Mick snorted. "Go slow is all I do now." Carlos chuckled. The sound was low and warm. "That's a start." Mick lifted his head. A spoon touched his fingers, steady and sure. He found the bowl by touch and took a bite. It tasted plain, but real. He hated that it comforted him. "You ever think about flavor?" he asked, surprising himself. "Every day," Carlos said. "I grew up on my mom's cooking. She seasons everything. Even her prayers got flavor." "Prayers don't have taste," Mick muttered. "They do if you listen," Carlos said. You can tell when somebody means it." Mick went quiet. He remembered the whisper through the wall last night. He had wanted to snap at the kid then. He hadn't. He didn't know why. After breakfast, Carlos helped him to the edge of the bed. "Let's stand, only a minute. My ribs don't like minutes." "They'll like you less if you don't move," Carlos said. "I got you." His hands were strong for a teen. He slid an arm under Mick's good shoulder and counted. 1, 2, 3. Mick pushed up. His legs trembled. Pain flashed across his chest like lightning. He caught his breath and stood. "Okay," Carlos said. "Feel the ground. Feel your weight in your heels, then toes. Good. Breathe." Mick did. The world steadied. He swayed and heard the beeping of a monitor somewhere down the hall. He smelled disinfectant and warm laundry. He felt the bump of the wall against his knuckles. They took a small step. Then another. At the fourth, Mick cursed and stopped. "You're doing fine," Carlos said. "That's good work." "Feels like falling slow," Mick said through his teeth. "Then I'm your net," Carlos answered. "Keep going." They reached the doorway. Mick rested against the frame, his breath short. A breeze slid across his face. He smelled wet earth. Someone laughed far away, young, free. It made something ache in him. "Sit by the window?" Carlos asked. Mick nodded. They shuffled to a padded chair. He lowered himself and let out a long breath. "What do you see?" Carlos asked softly. "You know what I see," Mick said. "Black. I tell colors by heat and smell and the way people hold their air. That's all I got." Carlos didn't argue. He set the coffee in Mick's palm. "Then we'll work with what you got. Some folks don't even try." "Trying got me nothing," Mick said. Carlos was quiet a moment. "You're still here." Mick sipped. The coffee bit his tongue and spread warmth. He kept his face turned toward the window. He couldn't see it, but he could feel the light grow stronger as the morning rose. It touched his cheeks like a hand. "Tell me something true," Carlos said after a while. "Like what?" "Anything. You, the road, the club, the storm." Mick set the cup down. He thought of engines and men, and the scream that had followed them a week ago. He cleared his throat. "Truth is, I know every sound a bike can make. I can tell if a belt is loose from 30 feet. I can hear if a man is lying by the way he chews gum. I can smell whiskey through a church shirt. But last night when you prayed, I didn't know what to do." Carlos breathed out slow. "You don't have to do anything. God does the heavy lifting." "That so?" Mick said. "That's what I've seen." They sat in that soft space a while. People passed in the hall. A cart rattled. A woman sang under her breath as she changed a bed. The day warmed. Later, Carlos brought a small box that clinked. He set it on Mick's lap. "I found this in the donation room." Mick ran his hands over it. Metal. Thin rods. Screws. He smiled before he could stop it. "Wind chime parts." "Can you fix it?" Carlos asked. "Blind man can fix anything that talks," Mick said. He let his fingers read the pieces. He felt the shape of the ring, the slits where strings would go, the tiny notches where knots liked to slip. He worked by feel, by habit older than hate. His hands knew what to do. As he threaded a line through the top ring, Carlos asked, "How'd you learn?" "At the home," Mick said. "Old volunteer named Gus. Said my fingers were better eyes than most folks' heads. Kept me out of fights, until I got old enough to win 'em." Carlos smiled at that, and Mick heard it. "You miss Gus?" "Man died when I was 16, Mick said. "I left the next week, joined the Saints by listening to the way the engines sang, down on 11th Street. You run toward the sound that calls you." "You could run toward a different sound now," Carlos said. "Maybe, Mick answered. He tied a knot tight and tugged. The rods clicked in a soft chord. Wind from the half-open window stroked them, and a clear note rose into the room. It trembled and settled like a bird in a new nest. Carlos let out a small laugh. That's pretty. Some things are, Mick said. By lunch, they had walked the hall 2 more times. Each time hurt, each time got easier by a breath. When they returned, Carlos set a tray down. Soup and a roll. Make it 2 rolls, Mick said. You don't need 2. I'm old and mean, Mick said. You feed me too? Carlos grinned and brought another. They ate. The soup tasted like chicken and thyme. The bread was warm. Mick wiped the bowl clean and leaned back, tired in a good way. In the afternoon, Carlos read out loud. He didn't read a sermon. He read a short book about a kid who wanted to build a boat and kept failing until he didn't. The words were simple. The rhythm was calm. Mick let the voice fill the room. Sometimes his mind slid away to the road. Sometimes it came back to the sound of waves he had never seen. When the chapter ended, Carlos closed the book. You fall asleep? Not a chance, Mick said, even though he had dozed for a minute. Kid built the boat too short, needed a longer keel. Carlos laughed. You were listening. I listen even when I don't want to, Mick said. Toward evening, footsteps stopped at the door. A woman's voice, strong, wary, said, Carlos, I need a word. Be right back, Mom, Carlos said. Mom, Pastor, Mick guessed. He heard them step into the hall. Their voices dropped, but the building carried sound like a drum. He caught pieces. That man. Dangerous. Not the same. Our family. You don't know what he's done. Mick stared toward the window. The wind chime sang 2 clear notes and fell quiet. Carlos came back a minute later. His tone was even but softer. You need anything before dinner? I need a fight, Mick said, but soup will do. Carlos huffed a small laugh. We'll do more walking instead. They walked, down the hall and back, past the laundry room and the tiny chapel that smelled like lemon oil, and the thin smoke of old candles. At the chapel door, Mick paused. He didn't go in. He stood and let the smell reach him, and for a blink he felt something ease in his chest. They returned to the room at dusk. The sky darkened behind the mist. The day had been long, full of little things that felt bigger than they should. Carlos helped him settle. I'll be on duty early tomorrow, he said. We'll do 2 more laps, maybe 3. You worry too much, Mick said. Someone's gotta, Carlos answered. Sleep. Let your body mend while you rest. Mick lay back. The wind chime brushed against itself, a small song in the dim. He listened to the buildings settle, to carts roll, to the last bit of day slip away. From somewhere down the hall, the woman's voice rose again, firmer now, with hurt beneath it. I said, leave that man alone. Mick closed his eyes against the dark that never changed. He wasn't sure if sleep would come. He wasn't sure if he wanted it. But he knew this. The boy with the steady voice had made the day move. And the night felt less sharp. He folded his hands on his chest, a habit he didn't remember learning, and let out a breath that didn't taste like anger. Outside, the mist became rain again, soft and patient, like it had all the time in the world. The next morning broke with a thin light, soft and cool after another night of rain. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the rehab center. Somewhere, an old radio hummed a country tune, low enough to blend with the hum of the vending machines. Mick woke to the sound of footsteps in the hall and the rattle of carts. He sat up slowly, every rib reminding him that healing took its own sweet time. The door opened, and the familiar voice met him before the scent of soap and coffee did. "Morning," Carlos said. "How you feeling?" "Like roadkill that got a second chance," Mick muttered. "That's an upgrade from yesterday." Carlos grinned. He set a tray on the small table. Oatmeal again, toast, and black coffee. "You're walking after breakfast. Doc says you need to move every 2 hours." "Doc can move himself," Mick said, but he reached for the cup anyway. He never liked being told what to do, but the warmth in Carlos's tone made it hard to fight. They ate in quiet. The morning light felt good on Mick's face, even if he couldn't see it. It made him wonder about things most people never thought about, like the color of the air or the shape of a shadow. "Ever think about getting new eyes?" Carlos asked suddenly. "They got surgeries and things now." Mick gave a dry laugh. "Kid, my eye's been useless since the start. Can't fix what was never made right. I learned to live with the dark." Carlos didn't push. He only said, "You learn to survive. That's not the same as living." Mick didn't answer. He sipped his coffee, thinking maybe the boy saw more than most men ever did. Later that morning, Carlos guided Mick down the hall toward the dining room. Voices filled the air. Soft laughter, spoons clinking, chairs scraping against the floor. Other residents greeted Carlos like family, and they nodded politely at Mick. He didn't know what to say, so he just gave a stiff nod back. Carlos helped him sit at a long table. Across from them, an older woman with trembling hands smiled. "You're the biker," she said. "That's me," Mick said flatly. "My brother used to ride," she said. "Said the wind could wash your sins off." "Did it work?" Mick asked. She chuckled. "Not for him, but maybe for you." Mick didn't know if she was teasing or not, but something about her words stuck. After lunch, Carlos led him to the small courtyard. The rain had stopped, and puddles shimmered on the brick path. Mick could feel the warmth rising from the ground. Somewhere close, he heard the buzz of a bee near the roses. "You always this calm?" Mick asked suddenly. "Not always," Carlos said. "Used to get in fights. That's how I ended up doing hours here." Mick tilted his head. "What for?" "Spray painting the wrong guy's car. He pressed charges. Mom said God uses messes to teach lessons." "Your mom's a preacher?" "Pastor," Carlos said. "Pastor June Carter. She runs the little church across the road. She's the reason this place even stays open." Mick let out a low whistle. "That explains the prayers." "Yeah," Carlos said with a grin. "She prays like some folks breathe." For a while, they sat in easy silence. The air smelled of wet leaves and sun. Then the door behind them creaked open. A woman's firm voice broke through. "Carlos, inside, now." The boy's shoulders stiffened. "Yes, ma'am?" Mick turned his head towards the voice. It was strong, steady, and carried the weight of someone used to leading. When she stepped closer, Mick could smell lavender and old paper, the scent of someone who spent time with books and prayers. "You're the biker," she said, and her tone held no warmth. "Mick Delaney," he said, "used to be president of the Iron Saints." A sharp inhale. "I know that name." Carlos shifted. "Mom," her words came cold. "That club crippled my husband 15 years ago. Bar fight in Mesa. You let it." The air went still. Mick's throat went dry. "Ma'am, I don't remember faces, but yeah, could be true." Her voice shook with anger she tried to hide. "He's in a chair because of that night." Mick lowered his head. "Then I'm sorry. That's all I got." "Sorry doesn't give him back his legs," she said. "And you—" She turned to her son. "You will not help this man again." "Mom, please." "No, not a word. This man brought nothing but pain. Let him find someone else to care for him." Carlos's voice cracked, but stayed calm. "He's not the same, Mom." "I said enough." Her footsteps stormed off, the door slamming shut behind her. Silence filled the courtyard. Mick sat still, feeling the boy's quiet beside him. "She's right," Mick said softly. "You don't owe me a thing. Go." Carlos took a deep breath. "I'm not leaving you alone. Not yet. You don't listen too good." "Neither do you," Carlos said. "Guess we're even." For the first time that day, Mick smiled. A small, tired smile that felt strange on his face. That night, rain returned, soft and steady. Mick lay awake, listening to it. He thought about the boy's mother, her voice sharp with pain, her words like nails hammered into truth. He couldn't blame her. He'd spent years pretending his choices didn't hurt anyone. Now her voice wouldn't leave his mind. From down the hall came a sound, soft music and Carlos's voice reading aloud to someone. The boy read slow, steady, with a tone that made even the silence listen. Mick closed his eyes and followed the rhythm. When the song on the radio ended, he whispered into the dark, "I'm sorry, whoever you were." He didn't even know who he meant anymore. The husband, the boy, the kid who died on the highway, maybe all of them. He rolled onto his side, facing the window he couldn't see. Somewhere, faint through the rain, a wind chime sang 2 gentle notes. He wondered if the boy had hung it there for him. As the night deepened, Mick's breath slowed. He felt something unfamiliar tug at his chest, something lighter than guilt, but heavier than peace. For the first time in years, he didn't dream of engines or fire. He dreamed of water, calm and endless, and a boy's voice saying quietly, "You can still start over." And for a moment, Mick almost believed it. The next morning broke with the hush that comes after long rain. The courtyard outside the rehab center glistened with puddles that caught the first gold light of dawn. Mick woke to the faint sound of someone sweeping the hallway. His ribs ached less today, but his heart felt heavier. Pastor June's voice from yesterday still echoed in his mind, sharp, certain, and right. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and sat up, breathing slow until the pain faded. The door opened with a soft click. Carlos stepped in carrying a small tray. "Oatmeal again," he said. "Doctor's orders." Mick grunted. "That doctor ever try eating this glue?" Carlos laughed, setting the tray down. "You'll get eggs tomorrow if you walk 2 full laps today." 2? Mick rubbed his ribs. "You drive a hard bargain, kid." Carlos didn't answer right away. He seemed quieter than usual. Mick could feel it. The boy's silence had weight. "She tell you to stop seeing me?" Mick asked. Carlos hesitated. "Yeah." Mick nodded. "Smart woman. You should listen to her." "I can't," Carlos said softly. "Sometimes you just know what's right even when it hurts." Mick tilted his head. "You're too young to talk like an old man." Carlos smiled faintly. "Someone's got to balance you out." They ate in silence after that. The rain had stopped completely, and faint birdsong drifted in through the cracked window. It should have been peaceful, but something restless stirred inside Mick. Later that afternoon, he packed his few things, his jacket, his cane, the small wind chime they'd built together. He'd decided. The boy didn't need his trouble, and the pastor sure didn't want him around. He could walk, more or less. He'd find another place. When Carlos came in, Mick was sitting on the bed, his bag at his feet. "You leavin'?" Carlos asked, already knowing the answer. "Best for everybody," Mick said. "Your mom's right. I don't belong here." Carlos stepped closer. "You belong somewhere. Maybe that's here for a while longer." Mick shook his head. "Kid, I've spent my life taking things that weren't mine. Time I stop." He stood, leaning on his cane. His ribs ached but held. The air smelled like wet pavement and the faint sweetness of soap. He made it to the door before Carlos spoke again. "Wait," Carlos said. His voice wasn't pleading. It was steady, sure, like the rumble before thunder. "Before you go, can I pray for you?" Mick almost laughed. "You really don't give up, do you?" Carlos smiled. "Never have." "Fine," Mick said with a sigh. "But make it quick." Carlos placed a hand lightly on Mick's shoulder. "Lord," he began softly, "you know this man better than anyone. You know the roads he's taken, the pain he's carried. If there's even one drop of light left in him, let him see it, just once." "Amen." The boy's voice was calm, but something in the air shifted. The room seemed to hum. Mick blinked, his breath catching. At first he thought it was a trick of his mind, a faint shimmer at the edge of nothingness. Then, in the darkness behind his eyes, a flicker sparked. A soft burst, like lightning far away. He froze. His heart thudded so hard he thought it might break. "Carlos," his voice trembled. I see something." Carlos's hand gripped his arm. "What do you see?" "Light," Mick whispered. "I think it's light." His knees buckled, and Carlos caught him as he sank to the floor. Mick pressed his palms over his eyes, shaking. The flicker grew, faded, then returned, a pulsing brightness that wasn't painful but alive. Tears rolled down his cheeks. Carlos's voice was gentle but awed. "It's real, isn't it?" Mick nodded, still crying. "It's real." They stayed there for a long time, the boy holding the man who'd lived a lifetime in darkness, and the man weeping like a child who had just seen his first sunrise. When Mick woke in the hospital later that day, his body was sore, but his heart felt raw and open. The nurse said he'd collapsed outside the rehab center, muttering about light. Doctors ran tests and muttered in disbelief about unexplained neural activity. That night, when the room quieted, Carlos visited. Mick could sense him before he spoke. The boy's calm presence filled the space like warm air. "They say your eyes are showing signs of healing," Carlos said quietly. "They don't understand how." "Neither do I," Mick said, staring at the faint glow through the bandages over his eyes. "But I saw it, kid. I really did." Carlos smiled, his voice thick with emotion. "Told you light was real." Mick turned his head toward the sound, his mouth trembling with something between laughter and a sob. "Guess you did the impossible, huh?" Carlos chuckled. "Wasn't me." "Then who?" Mick asked. Carlos hesitated. "Maybe God just decided you'd been in the dark long enough." Mick didn't answer. He only leaned back and let the silence fill the room. For the first time, he didn't fight it. He let it wrap around him, soft, forgiving, almost holy. Outside, rain began again, light and steady, drumming against the window pane. And for the first time in 60 years, Mick could tell where the window was, because he could see the faint glow that slipped through the glass. It wasn't much, just a whisper of brightness. But to him, it was the beginning of the world. Mick woke to a strange brightness behind the bandages. It wasn't just the glow he'd glimpsed before. It was real, steady, alive. He could feel it pressing against his eyelids, soft but constant. For a long time, he just lay there, afraid to open them. After 60 years of blackness, light was something he'd only ever imagined. A nurse entered, humming. "Morning, Mr. Delaney," she said. "How are we feeling?" Mick swallowed hard. I see light," he said quietly. The nurse paused. "You what?" "Light," he whispered again. "It's faint, but it's there." She hurried out, and moments later, a doctor arrived, voice brisk and excited. You're the patient with congenital optic nerve hypoplasia, yes? Mr. Delaney, if you're truly perceiving light, that's impossible. Seems to be a lot of that going around lately, Mick muttered. When the doctor removed the bandages, Mick gasped. The room burst open in white and gold, blurred and swimming like sunlight through water. He couldn't see clearly, only shapes, colors, movement, but it was sight all the same. His throat closed, his hands trembled. "Kid did it," he whispered, voice cracking. "That boy really did it." By the end of the week, they released him into the care of the Carters. Pastor June didn't look pleased, but she signed the papers anyway. "He's your responsibility, Carlos," she said firmly. "And your miracle doesn't excuse his past." Carlos nodded. "It's not about excuses. It's about what comes next." When they reached the small house behind the church, Mick stopped at the gate. The colors overwhelmed him. The gold of sunlight, the green of grass, the red roof of the chapel. They were fuzzy and soft, but dazzling. He covered his face with one hand. "It's too much," Carlos guided him gently. "Give it time. You've been blind a long while. Light takes getting used to." Mick laughed through tears. "That's one way to put it." Inside, the house smelled of soap, coffee, and the faint spice of Pastor June's cooking. Reverend Paul Carter sat by the window in his wheelchair, reading. His smile was slow and kind. "So," Paul said, "you're the man who made my wife angry and found the Lord in the same week." "Guess I've had a busy schedule," Mick said, shifting awkwardly. Paul chuckled. "You can stay here while you heal. There's a spare room out back. But you'll work. Chores, fixing, helping around the church. Deal?" "Deal," Mick said quietly. That first week, he learned the colors of the world the way a child learns to speak. The sky was blue, soft and endless. The soil was brown, warm under his fingers. Firelight was orange and alive, flickering like laughter. But his favorite thing was sunlight on water. The way it shimmered made him think of the voice that had prayed him into life again. He helped Carlos repair the old bikes stored behind the church. Carlos handed him tools, and Mick tried to name their colors. "Wrench," Carlos said. "Silver," Mick guessed. "Close enough," Carlos laughed. "That's chrome." Mick grinned, wiping sweat from his brow. "Same thing to me." They worked side by side, the clank of tools and the smell of oil filling the small yard. For the first time, Mick felt peace in a place that wasn't a bar or a back alley. That night, at dinner, Pastor June served roasted chicken, collard greens, and cornbread. Mick could see the colors, faint but rich. He tried not to stare at the faces around the table, faces he could finally see. Carlos's eyes were dark and warm. Pastor June's were steady and sharp, though softer than before. "Thank you for letting me stay," Mick said quietly. Pastor June hesitated. "Carlos believes you've changed. I'm still asking the Lord to show me if that's true." Mick nodded. "That's fair." After dinner, he sat on the porch while the others cleaned up. The sky deepened into purple and blue, stars winking into sight. He couldn't see them sharply, but he could feel their glow. For 60 years, he'd ridden through nights like this with nothing but wind in his face. Now, he finally saw what he'd been missing, and it broke him open. The next day, Carlos handed him an old carburetor. "Think you can fix it?" Mick smiled. "Kid, I used to build these blind. Now that I can see, it's almost cheating." Carlos laughed. "Then show me how." They spent the afternoon rebuilding the part together. Pastor June watched from the kitchen window, her expression unreadable. Reverend Paul wheeled out to sit beside her. "You still don't trust him," he said gently. "I trust God," she replied. "But that man put you in that chair." Paul sighed. Maybe so, but maybe God put him here to help me stand again. Just in another way. June blinked, looking back at the yard. Mick and Carlos were laughing at something, grease on their hands, light in their faces. Something inside her cracked, just a little. That evening, Mick walked into the chapel. The wooden pews glowed gold under the low lamps. The cross on the wall gleamed faintly. He sat in the back, staring at it. He wasn't sure what he believed. But he whispered anyway. "If you're real, thanks for letting me see." He didn't expect an answer, but somehow the silence felt full, like someone had heard. When he stepped back outside, Carlos was waiting. "You okay?" Mick nodded. "Yeah, just learning what light feels like." Carlos grinned. "Get used to it. You're not going back to the dark." Mick looked up at the stars, blurred, scattered, perfect. "Not if I can help it." The week rolled by slow and bright, mornings filled with birdsong and the smell of coffee. Mick fixed old lawn mowers and patched church fences. Every day, he learned something new about seeing, how shadows stretched long in the afternoon, how sunlight turned the dust golden, how colors changed with mood and weather. Every discovery felt like a small miracle. Carlos was always nearby, patient and steady. He never treated Mick like a project or a saint, just like a man learning to live again. Sometimes they worked in silence. Sometimes they talked about nothing and everything. Roads, music, hope. One hot afternoon, Mick sat wiping grease from his hands when a sound cut through the quiet. The deep, throaty rumble of motorcycle engines. Not one, but many. His body stiffened. He knew that sound the way he knew his own heartbeat. Carlos looked up from the carburetor. "You okay?" Mick didn't answer. The engines grew louder until they filled the churchyard like thunder rolling down a canyon. A dozen bikes turned into the drive, chrome glinting in the sun. At the front rode Razor, younger, leaner, and meaner than Mick had ever been. His tattoos glistened with sweat, his eyes cold behind dark glasses. The Iron Saint's emblem, a skull with wings, shone on every jacket. Carlos stepped forward instinctively. "Who are they?" Mick stood slowly. "Old friends," he said quietly. "The kind you don't invite to dinner." Razor swung off his bike, swaggering toward him. "Bones Delaney," he said with a crooked grin. "Thought you were dead." "Been trying to be," Mick said. Razor laughed, but the sound held no warmth. "You walked out, old man. Left your family high and dry, and now look at you, playing house with a preacher's kid." Carlos stayed still, his jaw tight. "You should leave," he said. Razor turned, smirking. "Look at this one. Got yourself a guardian angel, huh?" Mick's hands clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. "This life's over, Razor. I'm done." "Done?" Razor barked a laugh. "You don't get to be done. You built this club, you made us what we are, and now you think you can just walk away?" "I don't think I know," Mick said. Razor took a step closer. "You got soft. Heard the talk, Bones. Said some church boy fixed your eyes. Maybe he messed with your head, too." Carlos didn't back down. "You talk too much." Razor's grin faded. "You got guts, kid. I'll give you that." He spat at the ground near Carlos's boots, then turned to Mick. "You got 1 week. You either ride with us again or you're not just blind, you're dead." He swung back onto his bike and gunned the engine. The others followed, roaring out the gate, dust swirling in their wake. When the sound finally faded, the silence left behind felt heavy and sharp. Carlos turned to him. "You knew that would happen, didn't you?" Mick rubbed his face. "Didn't want it to, but yeah. Sooner or later the dark always comes looking." That evening, Pastor June found them sitting on the steps of the church, Carlos's hand was still greasy. Mick's shoulders were heavy with regret. "They came," she said quietly. "Yeah," Mick replied. "Razor. He's running the Saints now. He's meaner than I ever was." June crossed her arms. "You brought danger to my doorstep." "I didn't invite it," Mick said softly. "But I won't let it touch your boy." Her eyes narrowed. "Words are easy. You think a little light makes up for years of blood?" "No," Mick said. "It just gives me something to fight for." June didn't answer. She studied his face. The scars, the lines carved by years of sin and sorrow, and something in her expression softened, if only slightly. "Then you'd better mean that," she said at last, and turned back towards the house. Carlos watched her go. "She'll come around," he said quietly. Mick shook his head. "She's got every right not to." That night, the world seemed too quiet. The desert wind carried the faint smell of gasoline and dust, and Mick couldn't shake the memory of Razor's grin. He sat alone on the porch, the moon a pale blur above him. Carlos came out, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You ever think about going back?" he asked. "Every day," Mick said honestly. "Then I remember what it cost me." Carlos sat beside him. "You're not that man anymore." Mick stared out at the dark horizon. "Maybe, but that man's still out there somewhere waiting for a fight." Carlos took a slow sip. "Then we'll face him when he shows up." Mick turned, studying the boy's face. The calm, the faith, the unshaken courage. "You really believe that?" Carlos nodded. "I don't scare easy." Mick smiled faintly. "Reminds me of me, before I got stupid." Carlos chuckled. "Guess we all got something to unlearn." They sat together in silence as the wind moved through the trees, making the old wind chimes sing. The faint, gentle notes floated through the night, soft against the tension that waited beyond the hills. Mick closed his eyes, whispering, "Life's worth fighting for." Carlos looked at him, steady as ever. "Then we'll fight for it." And for the first time in a long while, Mick felt ready, not for war, but for whatever it took to keep the darkness from winning again. The next morning, the world looked softer. The storm had passed, and sunlight stretched across the small churchyard like a promise. Mick stood by the workshop out back, a wooden shed with peeling paint and a sagging roof. The old sign above the door read, "Storage," though inside it smelled of oil, rust, and memory. Carlos followed him in, carrying a broom and toolbox. "Mom says we can use this space," he said, "if we clean it up first." Mick ran his hand along a dusty workbench, feeling splinters and grooves carved by years of use. "What for?" Carlos smiled. "You said fixing engines kept you alive. Maybe it can help some of the kids around here too." Mick frowned. "You mean teaching them?" "Yeah," Carlos said. "Some of them come to church hungry, lost. You could teach them something useful." Mick chuckled softly. "You're out of your mind, kid." "Maybe," Carlos said, "but I think you got more to give than you think." Mick turned toward him, seeing the boy clearly now, his steady eyes, his quiet faith that didn't need fancy words. The idea stirred something in him. He had always known how to fix broken machines. Maybe broken people weren't that different. "All right," Mick said finally. "Let's get to work." They spent the day hauling out old junk. Busted chairs, boxes of hymn books, a broken lawnmower. Dust filled the air, making Mick cough and laugh at the same time. "Feels good," he said. "Feels like life again." Carlos nodded, wiping his forehead. "Once we paint and bring in the tools, this place could be something." By afternoon, the shed began to look different. Sunlight slipped through the window, landing on a shelf of tools that gleamed like hope. Mick stood back, and admired it all with a kind of pride he hadn't felt in decades. That evening, Pastor June came to check on them. Her arms were crossed, but her eyes softened when she saw the clean space. "What's this?" she asked. Mick wiped his hands. "A garage. Gonna teach some of your boys how to fix bikes instead of breaking laws." She hesitated. "And you think that will save them?" Mick met her gaze. "Maybe not, but it might give them something to believe in till God catches up." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she sighed. "We'll see," she said quietly, and turned back toward the church. Carlos grinned. "That's her way of saying yes." "Remind me to thank her later," Mick said with a wink. By the next week, the word had spread. 3 boys from the community showed up, nervous, curious, and full of restless energy. "This is Mick," Carlos told them. "He's going to show you how to make a bike breathe again." "Bikes don't breathe," one boy muttered. Mick chuckled. "Sure they do. You just don't know how to listen yet." He handed each of them a wrench and motioned to an old dirt bike. "Let's start simple. Strip it down, find what's broke, and fix it. No shortcuts. Machines are like people. They only work right when you respect what's inside." As the day went on, the boys started to relax. The sound of clanking tools filled the garage. Mick moved among them, correcting hands, explaining how each part fit together. He wasn't used to patience, but something about teaching calmed him. Carlos worked beside him, translating his rough talk into gentle guidance when needed. "What he means," Carlos said with a grin, "is don't force it. Feel the part before you fix it." Mick gave him a look. "You making me sound poetic, kid." "Someone's gotta," Carlos said. They laughed, and even the boys joined in. For a while, the garage echoed with voices that sounded like family. By sunset, the old dirt bike sputtered and roared to life. The boys cheered, jumping back as smoke puffed from the tailpipe. Mick grinned, pride swelling in his chest. "Told you she'd breathe," he said. Carlos snapped a picture on his phone. "That's proof," he said. "First miracle in the garage." Mick raised an eyebrow. "You call that a miracle?" Carlos shrugged. "Small ones count too." When the boys left, Mick and Carlos stood in the doorway, watching the sky turn gold and violet. The smell of gasoline mixed with the sweetness of blooming jasmine. Carlos leaned on the railing. "You ever think about what comes next?" Mick nodded slowly. "Every day. Used to think it was nothing. Now, I think maybe it's something worth waiting for." Later, after dinner, Pastor June came into the garage carrying a small box. She set it on the bench and opened it to reveal a wooden plaque. On it, she'd carved the words, "New Vision Garage." "Once I was blind, but now I see." Mick's throat tightened. "You made this?" She nodded. "Paul helped with the letters. Thought you might want to hang it." He ran his fingers over the words, tracing the grooves. The lump in his throat grew too big to swallow. "Thank you," he said softly. June gave a small nod. "My husband says you're teaching those boys more than engines. I hope he's right." "He's right," Carlos said. "You should see him smile when the bike starts." For the first time, June's lips curved into a faint smile. "Then maybe this light of yours is catching?" She turned and left, and Mick stood there staring at the plaque until the light faded. Carlos hung it above the door, stepping back to admire it. The golden glow of evening caught the lettering just right, and for a moment, it looked like the words themselves were shining. Mick wiped a tear he didn't mean to let fall. "Guess miracles come in all sizes." Carlos grinned. "Told you so." Mick looked out across the yard, where the last rays of sun touched the church steeple. For the first time in a long, long while, he didn't feel like running. He was home. The day of the charity ride began with clear skies and a hum of excitement that spread through the small town like music. The event was meant to raise funds for the Youth Outreach Program, the same one that had grown out of New Vision Garage. Dozens of riders lined up in the parking lot behind the church, engines purring like waiting lions. Mick stood by his rebuilt Harley, wearing a fresh leather vest without patches. His eyes, still weak but open, took in the shimmer of chrome, the crowd's faces, the blue stretch of sky. He hadn't been part of a ride since the crash. For a long time, he hadn't thought he ever would be. Carlos adjusted the band on his helmet. "You sure about this?" "Not even close," Mick said with a grin. "But I figure if I can see the road again, I'd better use it for something good." Pastor June approached, arms crossed but eyes warm. "This is the first fundraiser we've ever had with motorcycles," she said. "If one of you revs too loud during prayer, I will revoke your miracle." Mick chuckled. "Yes, ma'am." The laughter spread through the crowd, and for a moment, it felt like a family reunion, the kind built on second chances. When the ride began, the engines roared in unison, echoing through the desert hills. Mick led the line, Carlos riding behind him on the back seat, one hand steady on his shoulder. The wind rushed past them, sharp and clean. The world flashed in color, mountain ridges glowing gold, the highway stretching like a silver ribbon, sunlight dancing on the chrome of the bikes. Mick blinked tears away, not from the wind, but from wonder. Carlos shouted over the engines, "How's it feel?" "Like flying," Mick called back. "Like I never knew what life looked like till now." They passed families waving from the roadside, kids holding handmade signs that read, "Ride for Hope," and "God still doing miracles." By the time they circled back to town, the air was full of cheers and honking horns. Cameras flashed, and someone started clapping. Mick stopped his Harley, took off his helmet, and smiled wide as Carlos jumped down beside him. The crowd chanted his name, and a reporter pushed forward with a microphone. "Mr. Delaney, people are calling this ride a miracle. How does it feel to see again?" Mick looked at Carlos, then back at the reporter. "Truth is," he said, voice trembling, "I saw light before my eyes ever did. That boy right there showed it to me." Carlos's cheeks flushed. The crowd erupted in applause. Pastor June stood nearby, hands clasped at her heart, tears glinting in her eyes. That night, the churchyard glowed with string lights and the smell of barbecue. Music played softly while families ate and laughed. Kids from the garage showed off the bikes they'd fixed with Mick's help, beaming like they'd built the world itself. Mick stood beside Carlos near the fire pit, sipping lemonade. "Never thought I'd live to see a night like this," he said. Carlos grinned. "Guess you're stuck with hope now." "Could be worse," Mick said with a smirk. Pastor June approached, holding 2 plates. "Dinner's on me," she said, handing one to each of them. Mick blinked. "You forgiven me, Pastor?" She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I'm learning to. That's a start." "Fair enough," he said. They ate in companionable quiet, the laughter of the crowd washing over them. For the first time in his life, Mick felt full, not of anger or whiskey, but peace. But just as he started to believe the night would stay perfect, a sound cut through the music, the growl of motorcycles. Mick froze. Carlos looked up. Pastor June's smile vanished. The Iron Saints. The gang rolled in like a storm. Razor led them, his face shadowed under the streetlight. The laughter around the fire pit died. The kids stepped back, eyes wide. Razor killed his engine and swung off the bike, clapping slowly. "Well, look at this," he said. "Our fearless leader playing preacher." "Razor," Mick said quietly. "Don't do this." Razor smirked. You think you can just walk away, raise money for orphans, and we'd forget? You taught us loyalty, Bones. Then you spit on it. This isn't loyalty, Mick said, his voice steady. It's a cage. You just don't see it yet. Carlos stepped forward, standing between them. You need to leave. Razor's smile faded. You talk like you matter, kid. I do, Carlos said, because he's not yours anymore. The gang shifted, restless. One of them reached for his jacket pocket. Pastor June moved closer to the children, shielding them behind her. Put the gun away, Mick said, his tone sharp as broken glass. Not here. Not tonight. Razor's lip curled. You've gone soft. Mick stepped closer until they were face to face. Maybe, but soft don't mean weak. They stared each other down. Then Razor spat at his boots. Enjoy your miracle, old man. It won't last. He revved his engine, the others following, and roared away into the night. The sound faded, leaving the churchyard in heavy silence. The crowd didn't breathe until the last echo was gone. Carlos turned to Mick. They'll be back. I know, Mick said, and when they come, we'll be ready, but not with guns. Pastor June looked at him, surprised. Then how? With light, Mick said simply. Always with light. Later that night, after everyone left, Mick sat alone on the church steps. The string lights flickered softly. Carlos joined him, handing over a mug of cocoa. They'll try something, Carlos said quietly. Mick nodded. Yeah, that's what darkness does when it starts to lose. Carlos looked up at the stars. Then we don't let it win. Mick smiled faintly. You sound like you've been doing this your whole life. Carlos shrugged. Maybe I was meant to. They sat there together until the fire burned out, the desert air cool and quiet. Somewhere far off, thunder rumbled again, not from the sky, but from the road beyond the hills, the sound of engines gathering. Mick closed his eyes, whispered a prayer he didn't know he still remembered, and waited for morning. Morning came too early. The churchyard was quiet again, but the peace felt fragile, like a glass waiting to shatter. Mick stood at the window of his small room, staring out at the empty road. His vision, though still blurry, was clear enough to see the desert stretching far and wide. He'd ridden those roads 1,000 times, when they led to trouble, when they led to pain. Now they only led back to the past. Carlos knocked gently. You didn't sleep, he said, stepping in. Didn't plan to, Mick said. They'll come. Maybe today. Maybe tonight. Carlos crossed his arms. You think they'll try to hurt you? They'll try to hurt whatever I care about, Mick said. That's how Razor works. He wants me scared. Carlos met his eyes. Then don't be. Mick smiled faintly. You make it sound easy. Carlos shrugged. Faith usually does. But it isn't. By mid-morning, Pastor June gathered the youth group in the chapel. She prayed for safety, for courage, for peace. Mick stood in the back, his cap in his hands. He wasn't much for praying, but when she said, Lord, guard our home from those who carry anger, he whispered, Amen, under his breath. When the kids left, June walked over. If this danger you brought finds its way back here, she said softly, I'll hold you responsible. You'd be right, too, Mick said, but I won't let them touch you or your boy. Just make sure that Promise doesn't get him killed, she said. Mick's throat tightened. I'll keep him safe. She nodded once and left, her Bible pressed to her chest like armor. By afternoon, the desert sky darkened. Clouds gathered, heavy and bruised, and the wind picked up. Mick was in the garage checking the locks when Carlos came running, out of breath. They're coming, he said. I saw the dust on the road, 6, maybe 7 bikes. Mick's stomach dropped. Get everyone inside, lock the doors, call Sheriff Patterson. Carlos hesitated. You can't face them alone. I'm not fightin', Mick said. Not with fists. Carlos shook his head. They won't listen to words. Then maybe they'll listen to silence, Mick said. Minutes later, the roar of engines filled the air. The Iron Saints poured into the yard like a storm of metal and hate. Razor led them again, eyes wild, grin sharp. He shouted over the noise, "You really thought you could walk away, old man?" Mick stood tall in the middle of the drive, hands open, palms raised. "You don't need to do this, Razor." "You betrayed us," Razor yelled. "You turned on family." "That wasn't family," Mick said. "That was a pack of lost men chasing ghosts." Razor drew a pistol and aimed it at the ground between them. "You made me who I am. Now I'll return the favor." Before Mick could move, Carlos burst from the side door, shouting, "Stop!" The gun turned toward him. Time slowed. "Carlos, no!" Mick shouted, but it was too late. The gun fired once. The sound tore through the yard, louder than thunder. Carlos dropped to his knees, clutching his side. Razor froze, eyes wide, as the boy fell. Mick ran forward, catching Carlos before he hit the ground. Blood soaked through the boy's shirt, warm and bright. "No, no, no," Mick muttered. "Stay with me, kid, please." Carlos gasped, his voice small. "You said you'd protect them." "I will," Mick said, choking on the words. "You hear me? I will." Razor stepped back, face pale. "I didn't." He jumped in front of... Mick's head snapped up. "Get out!" Razor hesitated, then turned and ran. The bikes roared away, leaving dust and the echo of gunfire behind. Pastor June rushed out, her scream splitting the silence. "Carlos!" She fell beside them, pressing her hands to the wound. "Call 911. Mick's vision blurred. "He needs help now." Sirens wailed in the distance. Carlos's eyes fluttered. "It's okay," he whispered weakly. "It's okay, Mick." "Don't talk," Mick said, holding his face. "Save your breath." Carlos smiled faintly, blood on his lips. "Told you. Light's real." His eyes closed. The sirens grew louder. At the hospital, everything blurred into noise and white corridors. Doctors shouted orders. Machines beeped. Mick sat outside the operating room, his hands stained red. Pastor June sat beside him, silent. Her face was stone, her eyes hollow. After what felt like forever, a nurse stepped out. "He's alive," she said, "but he's in critical condition. We need prayers and time." Mick's breath came out in a shudder. He bowed his head into his hands. Pastor June whispered, "Lord, please." Her voice cracked. Mick whispered too, though he didn't know how to start. "If you're there," he said softly, "take whatever's left of me. Just save him." Hours later, Sheriff Patterson arrived, his face grim. "We caught Razor," he said. "He's in custody. Said it wasn't meant for the boy." Mick's voice was cold. "Doesn't matter what he meant?" Patterson nodded. "You did good calling us early. You kept it from turning into bloodshed." Mick shook his head. "Didn't keep enough of it." When the sheriff left, the hall grew quiet again. Pastor June stared at the wall, her fingers gripping a small cross around her neck. Mick turned to her, voice low. "I'll stay here till he wakes up." She didn't look at him. "If he wakes up." He flinched. "He will." She finally met his eyes. "Then pray harder than you've ever fought." He nodded. "I will." And he did. That night, alone in the sterile waiting room, Mick knelt on the cold tile floor. For once, he didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for sight. He asked for one thing only, for the boy who'd shown him light to find his way back to it again. The clock ticked past midnight. The machines in the room beyond beeped steadily. Outside, lightning flashed on the horizon. But this time, Mick didn't see darkness. He saw hope, faint, fragile, but alive. Mick left the hospital before dawn, the air cold and sharp with dew. He walked until the town disappeared behind him, until only the empty desert stretched ahead. His hands still shook. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Carlos falling, heard the gun, smelled the blood. He reached the old Iron Saints warehouse by instinct. The sound of laughter and clinking bottles leaked through the door. Razor was inside. Mick stepped in, his shadow falling long across the concrete floor. Razor looked up from the table, his face pale. "You shouldn't be here." "You're right," Mick said quietly. "But you shot my light, and I can't walk away from that." Razor's hand twitched toward his pocket, but Mick was faster. He kicked the gun aside and slammed him against the wall. "I taught you to be loyal," Mick growled, "but not to hate." Razor's voice broke. "I didn't mean to hit him." Mick's anger wavered, the fight drained out of him. "Then stop before you kill what's left of yourself." Sirens wailed in the distance. Sheriff Patterson, right on time. Razor stared at Mick, trembling. "You gonna turn me in?" he whispered. Mick stepped back. "No, you're gonna turn yourself in. Be a man for once." When the deputies burst through the door, Razor raised his hands. Mick stood there, breathing hard, feeling the weight lift off his shoulders. He looked toward the sunrise spilling through the broken windows. The world was still scarred, still hard, but it was filled with light. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of a monitor. Carlos lay pale and still, tubes running from his arms. Mick sat beside him, head bowed, eyes red from nights without sleep. He had faced bullets and storms, but nothing hurt like watching the boy who saved him hover between life and death. Pastor June entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She hesitated, then sat across from him. "You haven't left this room," she said softly. "Can't," Mick whispered, "not until he opens his eyes." She watched him for a moment, then said, "You think you caused this?" "I know I did," he said. "My past keeps spilling on people who never earned it." June looked toward her son and placed her hand over his. "Then pray with me." Mick shook his head. "I don't know how." "Yes, you do," she said. "Just talk to him." He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. "God," he said shakily, "you gave me sight. Now I'm asking you to give him breath. Take what's left of me if you have to. Just don't take him." For a long moment, nothing changed. Then a small sound. A sigh. June gasped. Carlos's fingers twitched. His eyes fluttered open, soft and confused. Mick gripped his hand, tears spilling freely. "Told you I'd keep you safe," he whispered. Carlos smiled faintly. "Told you light's real." June covered her mouth, weeping quietly as sunlight filled the room. For the first time, Mick didn't hide his tears. He just whispered, "Thank you," and knew someone was listening. Spring sunlight poured through the open doors of New Vision Garage, spilling across the concrete floor like a warm blessing. The air was filled with the scent of oil, sawdust, and lilacs drifting from the church garden. What had once been a dusty storage shed now buzzed with laughter and the steady clank of tools. Every sound, every smile, every spark of effort spoke of new beginnings. Mick stood near the workbench, wiping his hands on a rag. His sight wasn't perfect. Colors still bled together, edges blurred. But to him, the world had never looked clearer. Carlos knelt beside a dirt bike, tightening bolts with practiced care. The scar on his side caught the sunlight when he moved, a reminder of the price both of them had paid for grace. "Never thought I'd see this," Mick said, watching the teens gathered outside, helping one another. Carlos smiled. You mean see it or believe it? Mick chuckled, shaking his head. Both. Pastor June entered, carrying a tray of lemonade and sandwiches. Hard to believe this place used to be a pile of junk, she said, her voice soft with wonder. Reverend Paul rolled in behind her, his Bible resting on his lap. God sure knows how to make beauty out of broken things, he said. Even out of old bikers and scrap metal? Mick grinned. Guess he's got a strange sense of humor. Outside, the boys from the youth group worked on a row of engines, laughing and teasing each other. For the first time, Mick didn't just hear their laughter. He saw it, bright as sunlight. Sheriff Patterson stopped by, tipping his hat. Heard you're fixin' more than bikes these days, he said. Oh, and Razor took a plea. 10 years. He's running prayer circles in prison. Mick's eyes widened, then softened. Even darkness can find a spark, I guess. That evening, the town gathered for the garage's dedication. Strings of lights hung from the rafters, and a crowd filled the lot. Reverend Paul spoke first, his voice steady. This place began with broken men and broken engines, he said. Now it mends more than metal. It mends hearts. Applause rose, gentle and proud. Pastor June smiled through tears. Carlos placed a hand on Mick's shoulder. You did good, old man. Mick looked around at the glowing faces, the golden sky fading into blue. No, he said softly. We did good. The new sign gleamed above them. New Vision Garage. Once I was blind, but now I see. The wind chime swayed, singing its familiar tune. Mick looked up at the evening light, eyes wet but peaceful. Light never dies, he whispered, and deep down he knew. It never would. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.